I hate the color gray. It reminds me of a rainy day. Gray, I really hate that color. It's annoying, like my little brother.
That's a good poem, man.
It was all right.
It's like Ogden Nash.
You know, exactly.
A little light verse for you.
Me and my brother have a great relationship. He was 2. He was annoying.
Yeah,
you know?
he was annoying back then.
But I remember Miss Mueller came over to me. She looked over my shoulder. She read the poem. She put her hand on my shoulder. She turned around. She said, Clint, that poem is beautiful. You can be a writer when you grow up. She could have said that to every kid in the class, for all I know, right? She could have not meant it at all. But I remembered that moment for the rest of my life.
I'm John Green, and here at Study Hall, we want to know how people learn and how the way different people tackle education affects their lives, so we can all learn from their experiences. We're talking to people about that, and today I'm talking to writer, teacher, poet, historian, and Crash Course host, Clint Smith. We're talking about his life, his careers, and his college journey. We're going to begin with your early life and grade school to understand kind of how you got to where you are today. When it comes to the general vibe around education when you were growing up, what was that like for you? Like, how did you and your family think or talk about education? Was school something that you kind of had to go to, or was it something that you got to go to?
School was central. School was central. Education was central. My parents also conveyed that education was not just something that happened at school, right? Like education and learning, it is something that was kind of a praxis. It was a way of life. It was an ethos. It was something that should guide the way you lived. Curiosity was big in our house. I mean, we had the Encyclopedia Britannica collection, pre-internet, and if I had a question, they would say, go look it up. If I had a question about what a word meant, they'd say, go get the dictionary. The conversations we had around the dinner table were, at once intimate and funny and philosophical and, questions about religion and morality and why we are here. Not sometimes it'll be like, what time did the Saints play on Sunday? But I think my family provided a lot of space for us to ask questions and to not ever feel like asking questions was intrusive or annoying, but really that was the way that you learned about the world. That's the way you learned about who you are in relation to the world. And so I'm very grateful for that, and that often happened around the dinner table. That was like a very protected time in our home. They thought about school and conveyed this to us at a pretty young age, that learning happened everywhere. Education happened everywhere. It also happened in school. And the purpose of school was not singularly tied to one's academic mobility, right? That like a school played a much larger function in a community. Like a school was where you developed lifelong friendships. A school, especially the type of school that I went to, is amazing public school in New Orleans called Gene Gordon. I don't even think it exists anymore. But Gene Gordon was this really remarkable place. I mean, it's like a Disney Channel school. I mean, it was like all sorts of people of all different racial, ethnic, religious, class backgrounds, which is really rare in a lot of public schools. It was a special place because it was a place where there were so many different types of people learning academically alongside one another, but also learning how to be. And that was really important for my parents. They were like, part of the reason you go to this school is because you are going to meet people that you might not otherwise meet in a different context. And that's incredibly important.
Mm-hmm. Did you have dreams for yourself in terms of professionally? Did you imagine what grown-up Clint might be doing and have ambitions, professional ambitions?
I wanted to be a professional soccer player. Yeah.
Did you?
I wanted to grow up and be like Thierry Henry. I was an Arsenal fan. I became an Arsenal fan because my mom went to a conference for work in London. She was in the back of a cab, and she told the cabbie, she was like, "Oh, my son really likes soccer. What's the soccer team in London? Like, I want to get him a jersey. What's the soccer team in London?" She's bringing an American framework to this because she's like, as if there's one. She's like, oh, every city has one team.
Yeah.
And this cabbie, he turned around, he was like, "Ma'am, there's only one team in London, and that's Arsenal." And sometimes we think about, like, man, what if he had been a Tottenham fan?
You have a whole different life.
A whole different life.
I have a similar story, actually.
Oh, wow.
Yes, when I played soccer as well in middle school, not as well as you did, but I was on my middle school soccer team, and there was the kid, by far the best kid was English. His name was James.
Yeah, of course
and
it was
James would tell us these far-fetched stories about what soccer was like in England. He would say there were tens of thousands of people in the stands together, arm in arm, singing, just leaning forward, standing in the stands. And we would be like, that sounds crazy. We get 4 or 5 people at our games if we're lucky. And he said, and the best team in England is called Liverpool.
Wow.
And we all believed him, and that's why I'm a Liverpool fan.
And James shaped the trajectory of your life in that way.
If James had said the best team in England is Everton, I would have had a terrible life.
Oh, man. That's amazing. I love those moments, those sort of like chaos theory, the sort of butterfly effect. Where like this one, that if she had gotten in a different cab, if James had said a different team, that's amazing. So she brought me back an Arsenal jersey, and that was also around the time of the French World Cup, the World Cup that was hosted in France in 1998. And that was when a sort of 19, 20-year-old Thierry Henry broke onto the scene, and I was also playing soccer at a time and in a place where there weren't a lot of black soccer players. Right? And so the experience of getting that jersey, watching Thierry Henry play in the World Cup, watching him excel, and seeing that he looked like me was so important in ways I didn't have the language for when I was 9 or 10 years old. It was something that allowed me to feel more at home in the sport that I loved. It was like, oh, maybe not here in southern Louisiana, it might not be, there might not be a lot of black soccer players, but in other parts of the world. And so I felt really affirmed watching Henry, watching Arsenal, and I wanted to do that, and I wanted to be like that. I think that was the primary aspiration, but I loved writing, and I loved poetry, and I don't know that I would have said I wanted to become a poet or a writer, but I knew that it was possible. In 3rd grade, I had a teacher, Miss Mueller, and she assigned us to do this exercise where we wrote a poem about a color. And I chose the color gray. I was a strange child. I don't know why I chose gray. I'm pretty sure it went like this. It was, I hate the color gray. It reminds me of a rainy day. Gray, I really hate that color. It's annoying, like my little brother.
That's a good poem, man.
It was all right.
It's like Ogden Nash.
Exactly.
A little light verse for you.
Me and my brother have a great relationship. He was 2. He was annoying.
He was annoying back then.
But I remember Miss Mueller came over to me. She looked over my shoulder. She read the poem. She put her hand on my shoulder. She turned around. She said, "Clint, that poem is beautiful. You can be a writer when you grow up." She could have said that to every kid in the class, for all I know, right? She could have not meant it at all. But I remembered that moment for the rest of my life. And it's not to say that was, I decided I was going to be a writer in that moment and it was this sort of linear journey. But it made something, it gave me permission to imagine that something was possible that I don't know I otherwise would have imagined. And when I became a teacher, that was the thing I thought of more than anything. It's just that you never know how what you tell a young person is going to shape the trajectory of their lives. And
absolutely.
It might seem like they aren't listening or that it has little impact on them, but you can tell them something the way that James told you, the way that the cabbie told my mom, the way that Miss Mueller told me, something that changes the trajectory of your life. And it can also go the other way if you're not careful. You can say something that's incredibly damaging.
Yeah.
And so I was aware of how impactful what Miss Mueller told me was, and it stayed with me for a long time. And I think that becoming a writer in part happened and felt like it was something that could happen because I was told at the age of, 8 that it was something that I was good at and something that was possible for me.
So let's transition to talk about high school. Where'd you start high school and how'd you feel about it?
I went to Benjamin Franklin High School in New Orleans, and I think ninth grade was like a year of transition, of me trying to figure out like who I wanted to spend time with, what were the things that I felt like I'd outgrown, what were the type of interests that I had, and could I find people who shared some of those interests. And soccer remained a big part of my life then, and it became really central to my identity. I think that I was kind of known in high school as like Clint the soccer player.
You were kind of the soccer kid.
Yeah, I was the soccer kid. We had never won a state championship before. We won a state championship my sophomore year. I made all-state, all-metro. So like internally, it was very central to my own sense of my existence and my value. Externally, I was being told that like, this is what I'm good at. This is what I'm celebrated for.
And so often when kids are told what they're good at, like they believe you.
Yeah.
And if that's soccer, if that's poetry, whatever it is, like I remember that, I like won an author prize when I was in third grade, and that's absolutely why I'm a writer.
Interesting. Oh, man.
It's because it was the first time anybody had ever told me I was good at anything.
Yeah. Soccer was very central to my identity because it was what I was told I was good at. It was what I felt like I was good at. And then Hurricane Katrina was my senior year of high school. Right
before senior year, right? Like wasn't
so
it
3
August?
days into senior year.
3 days into senior year.
3 days into senior year.
Wow.
And if ninth grade, the early part of high school was like trying to figure out who my people were, who my community was, who shared my interest, because I was interested in soccer, but I was also interested in books. I was also interested in politics. I was also interested. And so you're trying to find people who like share the range of interests you have, or people who celebrate the multifacetedness of your identity.
Right.
Because I think it can be hard. Like you might find somebody who values a part of what you do, or part of who you are. But it can sometimes, at least for me, felt tough to find folks who I felt like I could be the fullest version of myself with. And I think that's especially difficult when you're still trying to figure out who that fullest version of you is.
Right.
So you're at once trying to discover who you are, and you're also trying to discover people who celebrate all that you are, and who also will give you room to grow into the parts of yourself that you have yet to even encounter.
Right.
I hadn't even thought about this in a while, but in my ninth grade year, like I suffered from a pretty intense depression. And it was the first time I'd ever gone to therapy. It was the first time, but it was probably like half of that year where I felt really low. But I remember feeling the depression was also associated with like a sense of confusion and shame, because it was confusing because I wasn't clear what brought it on. And it was just, there's this sort of like, it's the sort of cliche metaphor, but like it really did feel like a cloud just kind of following you around. And I was like, why do I feel so low? Sadness isn't even the right word to describe it.
It's
like,
deeper than that.
Yes, I felt so low, and this feeling of like not wanting to get out of bed. And that was for many months. But thanks to a great therapist, I came out of, or sort of emerged from that period and had a really positive sophomore and junior year. And then, as I said, senior year, I remember the summer before senior year just feeling the most confident and like most self-assured that I had ever felt. I was like, I've got my group of friends that I love. I've got this sport that I'm like, I'm going to be captain of the soccer team this year. I just felt like girls were paying attention to me in a way that was, that hadn't been the case in like middle school and stuff like that. I was like, this is going to be great. This is going to be my year. And then 3 days in senior year, we had to evacuate. And that was nothing new because, you're from New Orleans. We evacuated for hurricanes every year, every other year. Since I was a kid, there's like big storms coming. You pack a duffel bag, you drive, sometimes you stay, maybe in your house or in a hotel, or oftentimes we would drive to Houston to stay with my aunt and uncle.
But you expect to be gone for a week.
You expect to be gone for, if that, like a few days. It's like you have extra time to study for your math tests, pack a couple, days worth of underwear, and then you come back, pick up some branches, and then it's done. Katrina obviously was very different. And I don't, people before the storm, people were saying, this is a different one, this is a different one. But they had said that before. And certainly I was 17, I wasn't paying nearly as much attention as my parents probably were. But we left, and I remember we were doing something different than we had done before. Like my parents were put all of our family photographs in trash bags and moved them up to our attic, which is not something I remember them doing before. And to me, that was a signal that, there's a different approach or a different sense of wariness about this that now I can kind of look back retrospectively and understand as a sort of omen of what might have been to come. And so I was in Houston, and 80% of New Orleans was underwater after the levees broke. And it became clear very quickly that I wouldn't be going back to New Orleans anytime soon. I remember sitting on the couch in Houston at my aunt and uncle's watching CNN. We were maybe like a week, 2 weeks into this, and just seeing I never saw my house on the news, but I saw the grocery store we used to go to. I saw the church we used to go to, and they were just submerged. And
did your family photos survive?
Some of them did.
But I'm sure the loss was profound. Not just, it's not just the loss of all these items associated with your life. It's also the loss of the life that you thought you were going to have, the senior year you thought you were going to have. I'm sure that's something a lot of young people today can interact with through the lens of COVID, through the lens of their losses. But you suddenly, the senior year you were going to have was completely taken away from you.
Oh, yeah.
And your whole life must have been upended.
Yeah, I thought about that a lot during the COVID lockdown. I thought about all these stories were coming out of kids who didn't get to have their senior prom, who didn't get to have their graduation, who didn't get to have their senior season, whatever sport, or on the yearbook, or and that is a real loss. Like I think sometimes that kind of thing, especially when it was happening, some of that got lost or felt less significant than because we were surrounded with so much death and so much uncertainty. I think those other spaces of loss were relegated to the peripheries of our concerns, but certainly not if you are one of those young people who lost those things. That is a real and painful thing to have that stripped away from you. And
what was that like for you?
It was hard because again, you sort of imagine your senior year and you imagine your life looking a certain way, going in a certain direction. Imagine the texture of your days in a specific way, like you've spent all this time in this high school, like you have a clear sense of who you are, you have a clear sense of who you want to be, what you want to do, and suddenly you end up in a completely different geographic, social, cultural context. For me, so we were 2 weeks in, and then I was getting recruited for different college soccer teams at the time, and I had several official visits scheduled throughout the fall. And I got a call maybe 2 weeks into Katrina, and it was from the coach at Davidson College, a guy named Matt Spear. And Coach called and he said, "Clint, I know you must be going through so much right now. I can't imagine what you and your family are experiencing. I know your official visit isn't scheduled. This is probably in early September." And he was like, "I know your official visit isn't scheduled for later in the fall, isn't scheduled until later in the fall, but I was wondering would you want to come up this weekend? Maybe you can serve as a sort of distraction." And I was like, absolutely. Because I was just sitting on the couch watching CNN, just being depressed all day. And so I got on a plane that weekend, and I went to Davidson College, and we had a soccer game against like our crosstown rivals, UNC Charlotte. They won 3-2 in overtime. There was like a crazy college party after, and I was the 17-year-old, and everybody was like, all the college girls were like, "Oh, you're from New Orleans? Oh my gosh, that's so sad." And I was
so
like,
sorry.
It is so sad. Let me tell you all the ways it's so devastating for me. And then I went to class, and I was Davidson's a tiny liberal arts school, and the classes were so intimate, and so like everything was like a Socratic seminar, and we were sitting around talking about there was political science class and having conversations that felt so robust and intellectually profound, and I spent time with people who felt so safe and felt so welcoming. And I remember maybe 24 hours later calling my dad and telling him, this is where I want to go. I was like, this is where I want to go. I had a great experience there, and I loved it, and I'm grateful for my time at Davidson. It's also very clear to me that now that I selected it in that way and so quickly because I needed an anchor in the midst of this sort of sea of uncertainty. I needed something to hold on to say, like, this is where I don't know what's going to happen now. I don't have a school. I don't have a house. I don't know what this means for my parents' jobs. But I know where I'll be in 9 months. And I think I emotionally and psychologically needed that thing anchored in the ground to provide some sense of steadiness for me. And I think it was really important for me to have that throughout the course of my senior year. But what's interesting then is that I went, it was my last day there, and the Davidson admissions community and the coach were acutely aware of everything that was going on with me. And so I remember I went to the office, and they said, do you have a school, like in Houston? Like, it was clear that I wasn't going to be going back to New Orleans. My school was underwater. And they said, let's help you find a school. And they pulled out this binder, and they called this school Audi International, which was this international school in Houston. And we went back to Houston the next day and visited the school, and I think started maybe later that week.
Wow.
And it was amazing. I mean, and so for me, I felt indebted to Davidson. I felt like it was a place that brought me in, took care of me, felt so nourishing, and that is how I ended up at Davidson, and that's also how I ended up where I was my senior year of high school. And it was that was a very different environment than
a
previous
big public school.
Oh, very different. I mean, I think there were people from like 70 or 80 different countries.
Wow.
You walk through the hallway and people are speaking French and Spanish and Arabic and Mandarin and Korean. And I mean, I'd never been anywhere like it was like studying abroad for a year in Houston, Texas. It was incredibly revealing also because so much of my experience K through 11 at these various public schools in New Orleans was that these were very mixed income communities, the students were coming from mixed income backgrounds. And that was not the case at my private high school in Houston. And so it was interesting because I later would go to grad school, and I was trained by sociologists thinking a lot about like race and class and the intersection of these things, and economic and social mobility. And I think that going from these public schools in New Orleans to this private school in Texas gave me a sort of firsthand encounter of the different manifestations of wealth, the intersection of like financial capital, social capital, cultural capital, and how if you had one, you had access to another. And again, I didn't have the sort of like Bourdieuian language around it at that point, but it was striking to me to see how people with large amounts of money navigated the world in ways that were similar or very different than people I knew at my previous schools and in New Orleans.
So when I was growing up, there was definitely an expectation that my brother and I would attend college. Was that an expectation in your family, or was it more, college was something to aspire to, or was it something that you always knew you were going to pursue?
It was always an expectation, for sure. And I think it was an expectation that I would go to a historically black college. Everyone in my family went to an HBCU. And for me, it was always kind of understood that I would be a part of that lineage, that I would be a part of that tradition. I mean, my family and so many black families owe our social and economic mobility to the existence of those institutions. I mean, historically, black colleges played like an incredible role. Like you almost can't even like do justice to how central those institutions have been to creating a black middle class, to lifting up thousands, tens of thousands, millions of black people and families from relative poverty and obscurity after the end of the Civil War into the middle class and into a position where social and economic mobility was even possible. And I think my family was very proud of that. My family is very much a product of that. My grandfather he ultimately became the president of HBCU in Mississippi Valley State University. And so that was so central to my understanding of what college was. Like I didn't, for a long time, didn't imagine college, going to a college that wasn't an HBCU.
Were your parents and family disappointed that you chose Davidson?
I don't know if I was. I mean, on one level, yes. On one level, because I was the kid who had like future Morehouse Man shirts when I was 2 years old. Like, I mean, I was adorned in like all of the paraphernalia. My dad, my dad originally was at the University of Florida. I had a really negative experience. He ran track. He was a great athlete, and he ran track at the University of Florida. And for a host of reasons, including the racism he experienced there, he left and went to Morehouse. And I think because he experienced both, because he went to like a big, predominantly white state school and then went to Morehouse, he felt very strongly about his children not experiencing what he did at the University of Florida. And he was like, Morehouse, I am who I am because of Morehouse College. Our life looks the way that it does because of Morehouse College and Spelman College. It probably is the thing he felt most strongly about in terms of my educational journey than anything else. And at some point they understood and began to understand that soccer was something that mattered to me a lot, that I was good enough to play at a college level, and that Morehouse didn't have a team. And so I think when I started looking at beginning the sort of college process, And when I started to be recruited to play soccer in college, I think they came to terms with the fact that that would not be a part of my journey. As disappointed as they were that it wasn't. They understood. I think they wanted the HBCU experience for me because they knew how much it meant to them. But I think at no point did they try to force me to go somewhere else. They very much let me and my journey sort of lead the decision process.
Well, I really like what you said about choosing Davidson because you needed an anchor in this time of immense uncertainty, and understanding now that that's why you made the choice, maybe if you didn't even understand it then.
Yeah.
And I think so often, because the college choice is such a big, important choice, it has so much to do with the life that we end up leading. You know, I often think my life would be so different if I hadn't gone to Kenyon, where I went to school. But of course, it might have been better. Or it might have been worse, or it would be different. I would have different friends. I would maybe have a different spouse. I would have a different family. My life would be vastly different.
100%.
But you're always making that decision with relatively low information, right? And so it's easy to be overwhelmed by the process of choosing a college because it is a decision that can dramatically affect your life. But at the same time, it's kind of okay that you make the decision with low information because that's the only way to make the decision. You know, we can have a vague idea about what kind of school we like or what kind of environment in which we learn the best. We can have those concepts, but ultimately, you're a kid and you're making a decision partly because you need stability in an ocean of instability because you've just been displaced by Hurricane Katrina, and that's the particular college coach who happens to call you and say, come visit this weekend.
It's such an important point. I think it goes to the, kind of what we were speaking about at the beginning of our conversation in some ways. Like, so much of this ends up being the sort of arbitrary nature of circumstance and a moment. Something in your life might prime you to go to a certain place over another. And, for me, the thing that took precedent more than anything was stability, because Davidson was so small and it did not feel overwhelming. Like, nothing about it felt like if, I don't know if, it would have been a bigger school, a school with like 20 or 30,000 kids. If I would have felt that same sense of security that I felt when I was at Davidson. Because I think a huge part of it is that they called first, but I think another part of it is that they called first and that it was a place that was so tightly knit together. Like in terms, it was less than 2,000 kids. So it was kind of just like it was like a boarding school almost, like a boarding school vibe. All the professors live down the street, and you go over to their house to eat pie while you take the poetry class, and
it's very idyllic. For small liberal arts schools in terms of the professors and visiting them and reading poetry with them.
Absolutely,
all of that is real.
It is real, and I think that I needed something that would kind of wrap me in its arms in that way. And I think a bigger school might have felt increasingly unwieldy. Again, in a time in my life where everything felt unwieldy, where everything felt up in the air and uncertain.
Right. So was there ever a conversation about college cost? I assume that because of the nature of your athletic talents that the cost was covered. Is that correct?
Yeah. So for me, I was always certain schools were offering different levels of funding, scholarship funding. Davidson gave me funding that was partially athletic funding and partially academic funding. And so I'm very lucky in that regard.
Also, a lot of hard work goes into that. I've seen enough of elite athletics to know that it's not just luck.
Yeah.
You chose to major in English, is that correct?
I did.
And what was other than your third grade teacher telling you that really good Ogden Nash poem about the color gray was good, what were the kind of reasons that you chose to study English?
It was similar to a similar experience to my third grade teacher. I had another teacher, a professor, who was who ran the sort of writing seminar, the sort of like 100 level, like every freshman has to take this English writing class. And I wrote an essay, was I think like the first month in. We had to write a series of essays or stories about, I think like one every 2 weeks. And one of the first ones I wrote was, because it was top of mind, Hurricane Katrina. And it was just about the experience of evacuating from Katrina, the sort of emotional uncertainty of what my life would look like, of what it felt like in my body to watch as these parts of my community were underwater, as I sort of emotionally felt underwater. And, you know, this was maybe like a 800-word thing that I wrote. And the professor, Gil Holland, I mean, we're talking about Davidson as idyllic. I mean, like, you have Davidson and you have like the soda shop on Main Street, and the professors, you know, having their students over for pie during class time, and he contributed to the sort of like idyllic nature of it, almost so much that I was like, all right, everybody, like, what is this?
Are we really doing this? Are we really doing this? Play?
But like, he was like Santa Claus. I mean, he was this jolly man. He had this like long white beard. He just the most like jovial disposition. His laugh was so like it filled the room. This round belly, this tweed jacket. It's just like so absurdly kind and generous. And he brought me in. I went to office hours because he had asked me to come talk about what I had written. And he placed the essay I'd written about Katrina on the desk, and he was just like, Clint, this is extraordinary. Like, this is so good. You're so talented. You have so much to say about the sort of both the external world and the interior self. And, you know, nobody had ever talked to me that way before about my thoughts, and the way that my thoughts and ideas and feelings manifested themselves on the page like that. I mean, I guess I got a third grade iteration of that with Miss Mueller.
That's a long break, though.
That was a long break. And, but for this person who had been an institution at he had been at Davidson for decades. For him to say that in that moment was so meaningful, because it was also, and I think this speaks to what I think a lot of young people experience. For me, I had gone to Davidson, I had gone to college, and I felt, not from my parents, but from the world, that like I had to get a degree in something quote unquote practical, useful, that there had to be a very specific professional utility to the thing that I was learning, and that if I was not orienting my academic work around that it was like a waste of time. Davidson is 20 minutes north of Charlotte, North Carolina. Charlotte was, and even more so is now, like the sort of central center of banking in America. Like, it's basically Charlotte, New York, and many Davidson alum go into banking, go into finance, go into all manner of
moving a pile of money around, making it
lots
bigger.
of money, moving them, investing them. It disappears, it reappears. You know,
it seems like you were built for this work.
Clearly, I think that's why I didn't get any of those internships.
You and I even trying to describe the world of finance.
And I was so I took an econ class and I failed, and I got like a F. I failed that class. I never failed a class in my life. And it was clear that I was not that is not where my intellectual energy wanted to go.
Right.
Even though I was telling myself that it should be how my mind worked.
Right.
And so I was in the process of failing this class. And then Gil Holland told me that I was an extraordinary writer with extraordinary important things to say. And I said, I'm going to be an English major. I love to read. Gil Holland says I have important things to say. And I think that's when I decided that's what I was going to do. And I wasn't necessarily concerned with or thinking about, like, how will this be useful? I just tried to lean into the fact that it felt intellectually nourishing in ways that nothing else had.
Yeah. So a lot of the challenges for people in their first year of college, I mean, focus around two things, I think. On one hand, you have the social challenge of being in a completely new environment. And then you have the kind of academic executive functioning challenge of setting your own schedule and having to do your own homework and reestablishing your identity with a new group of people. And all of that stuff is happening at the same time. What was that like for you?
I think that this is when being an athlete was really helpful, because my life was kind of, especially at the beginning, it was my social world had already been constructed for me. You know, college is this period of time, similar to the way we discussed in high school, where you can not reinvent yourself, but like step into, I think college as an opportunity to step into a fuller version of yourself, because you are not, in some ways, handcuffed by the version of yourself that your high school classmates think you are. Because there's a lot of growth that happens between 9th grade and 12th grade, but like to some people, you will always be the person you were in 9th or 10th grade. And so for me, what was interesting is that my whole life had kind of been building up to this moment as I had imagined it. I wanted to play soccer at an elite level. I was at a school that was a Division I athletics program, but what happened is that I didn't play. And I was on the bench pretty much all of college. And I had this sort of 18, 19-year-old existential crisis where I was like, this thing that has been central to my identity my whole life, this thing that's been central to who I understand myself to be in the world, that gives me a sense of value, a sense of purpose in the eyes of others and in the eyes of myself, I'm not good at anymore. And it was really jarring, and it was really unsettling. But I also feel so grateful that I was at a school that was a small liberal arts school that really encouraged athletes to figure out who they were off the field or off the court. And so while I wasn't getting a lot of playing time with soccer, I was like, all right, well, what matters to me outside of this? And I joined a historically black fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha. I joined the school newspaper. I was ultimately becoming like the editor of the opinion section of the paper. I started a poetry club at Davidson called Free Word, and we basically like cosplayed the Dead Poets Society on Sunday nights. We read poems and we wrote poems and we shared poems, and I wrote so many bad poems for a long time, but it was so great because all of those spaces, the newspaper, the poetry club, the Alpha, they were very different social communities than my soccer team. And I so valued having different spaces that allowed me to tap into these other versions of myself, these other parts of myself, not versions, other parts of myself that allowed me to also explore things that were emerging in new parts of me that I was in the process of discovering.
So you probably didn't have the college experience you thought you were going to have, in the sense that you weren't the captain of the soccer team, you didn't become this big star, you didn't have the professional career you maybe dreamt of, but instead you found your way into new communities in addition to your soccer community, and that was a big part of how you got through college. You get through college, and then what were those first few months like when you're like, oh wait, what I have to have a job now? Because I remember for me, I became a hospital chaplain. That's how radically off the wall my decision was. I wanted to be a writer, but it seemed like being an astronaut or something, like it didn't seem like something regular people did. And so I wanted to find a career path. But did you think about trying to go straight into writing?
I think that I knew that I could continue writing no matter what job or I took that would pay me a salary. And I think part of that was because in college and coming out of college, I had begun to be part of the spoken word and slam poetry community, like Charlotte, North Carolina, again, wasn't far from Davidson, and they had like an incredibly beautiful and robust slam poetry community. And all of those people had other jobs, right? They were people whose lives, writing was a central part of their lives, but it was almost the like home they came. It was writing was like the home they came back to. Like they went to their jobs and then they came home to this community. And so, for me, I certainly was not at that point imagining my life as a writer as it exists today. I wanted to go abroad. I'd studied abroad in Senegal in my junior spring of college, and it was one of the most transformative experiences of my life. I lived half the time in Dakar and then half the time in a village on the western side of the country. And it was my first time visiting Africa, living in Africa, and especially as an African American who has descendants from West Africa but can never be sure or know where exactly those descendants are from. It was a sort of really profound experience to sort of attempt to reconnect with a part of my history that is at once so proximate but so distant. And I was really interested in sort of furthering that experience on like a sort of identity level, but also when I was in Senegal, I got really interested in public health work. And so I lived in South Africa for a year after I graduated, doing work around HIV/AIDS in Johannesburg. And I always tell young people, like, if you can live abroad, you should do it. It was both Senegal and South Africa. I can't imagine my life without those experiences. It made my view of the world so much more, so much less parochial. It made it so much more expansive, so much, I think I became a more generous person, a more empathic person, a more culturally competent person. And you begin to recognize the way that what the world looks like and exists like, not just outside of America, but outside of a sort of Western framework. And that was incredibly valuable and life-changing to me. And also Johannesburg ended up having this really amazing performing arts scene, and I was like very deep in the poetry and spoken word scene in Johannesburg. And then I came back from South Africa and I became a teacher. I became a teacher in Prince George's County, Maryland. My main goal was to make the DC slam poetry team. And it was what like motivated me as a writer for so long. And I made that team and was on that team from 2011 to 2014. We won the National Poetry Slam. And to me, that was like the Super Bowl. Yeah. That was like the Pulitzer. I was like, oh, I did the thing. I'm ready to wrap it up now. Like it was amazing. It was so that world meant so much to me. And I would not be a writer in the way that my writing life exists today without that community, without that time. I think sometimes people can denigrate slam poetry or spoken word as not being real literature or somehow being lower on the sort of literary totem pole than some other things, or being gimmicky or being, but for me that is where I learned how to write. That is where I learned how to tell stories. And and there is only a How the Word is Passed because there was a DC Slam poetry team, and I will forever be grateful for that.
How'd you decide to teach?
I think I learned through the poetry club, through Free Word, because I started the club, I started the organization, and so I was responsible for like figuring out how are we going to spend this hour, every Sunday. I fell in love with it in college, and I think leading that group led me to recognize that I also really loved facilitating it, and I didn't think of it at the time as like, oh, I'm being a teacher in this way, but it was the first. Sort of one of the first iterations of that. And so I joined Teach for America. I applied to Teach for America and was accepted, and said where I wanted to be, hoped to be placed. And I was taught in Prince George's County, and I was a high school English teacher. I always think of something you said when you were talking about my book. And I repeat this all the time because I think it's a ethos that we share in life, is the sort of both-andedness of the world, of history, of our own identities, of our politics, of so many things. I was really interested in sort of exploring the both-andedness of the world through the lens of literature, and like sharing that experience with young people. And it was in the spirit of both-andedness, both the hardest and most rewarding thing that I've ever done. I mean, it was so hard. School started at 7:30. I was like, why is a high school
every day? Every day.
I was like 7:30.
5 days a week.
It's
the worst time to try to teach children.
It is absurd, especially teenagers.
Yeah.
And so I hated waking up that early, and wouldn't wake up that early again until my children were born. And then I had no choice.
Yeah.
But that's not a job you can sort of step away from in the same way. But it was a really, I don't think anything that exists in my life now would have happened or been possible had I not become a teacher.
Yeah, yeah. And then you go on to grad school. You go to Harvard. Not to brag on you, but that's a school with a pretty good reputation.
It's all right.
How did your PhD work? First off, like, why did you choose to go back to grad school, and how did your PhD work eventually lead to the extraordinary book that is How the Word is Passed?
I started getting interested in applying to grad school, obviously when I was teaching. I think in my third year teaching, I taught at a school. It was a minority school. 95% of the students were Black or Latino. Many of them were from immigrant families. Many of them were undocumented. Many of them and or their family members were or had been part of the criminal legal system, and had been proximate to police, incarceration, at various points of their life. It was a very present reality in the way that they navigated their lives. And I think when I became a teacher, I was told that, like, I think education was presented in some way as like, if we solve education, we can solve economic inequality. And this is how we will have millions of people and families achieve social mobility, is by solving public education. That is unquestionably a huge part of how you, one of the interventions that you need in order to create more social and economic mobility for people. But sometimes I feel like we talked about education as if it was something that it was its own island, rather than being a part of a larger ecosystem of social, political, and historical realities that shaped what our students and their families' lives looked like. And so for me, most of my students were, free and reduced lunch, living in poverty. And I was becoming acutely aware of the larger social ecosystem that shaped what their lives looked like when they left school every day. And I got increasingly interested in trying to explore what the relationship of education was to these other parts of young people's lives, and specifically got really interested in the relationship between education and incarceration. And so I applied to grad school and was thinking a lot about the school-to-prison pipeline, thinking a lot about what it looks like to interrupt that, what are the most important and successful and proven interventions in preventing specifically, but not singularly, Black and Latino boys from dropping out of school and ending up in prison.
Right.
So I applied to school, and I only applied to Harvard because they were starting a new interdisciplinary PhD program at the School of Education that was focused on, that was interested in thinking about education, but on the terms that I had been thinking about it, not as something that exists in isolation, but something that is part of a much larger landscape of social realities. And so I applied there, and I was like, oh, if I don't get in, like, I'll keep teaching. Like, I could keep teaching for the next 30 years, and like, I would be perfectly happy. I really did, like, talking to teenagers about books is one of the best things. And that's where I discovered John Green books. Because I was like, what will they read? And they read some John Green, man. They loved those books, as do I. And so so I applied, and I got in, and I got there this is in 2014, fall 2014, and maybe 2 weeks before I started grad school, Mike Brown was killed in Ferguson, Missouri. And so that was, in many ways, we mark the beginning of the Black Lives Matter movement as being the death of Trayvon Martin in 2012. But I think a new phase of it in many ways began in 2014 with the death of Mike Brown in Missouri. And so my early graduate school experience was like very much animated by political activism on campus, by the Black Lives Matter movement, shaping the sort of activism we were doing on campus, that we were doing in the sort of larger Boston and Massachusetts community. It was shaped by going to protest. It was shaped by protesting our own institution. And in the midst of that, by me spending time studying and reading about a history of economic and racial inequality that created the landscape of inequality that exists today, which is deeply tied to the reasons that it was this period of time when we saw the way that police and the criminal legal system were interacting with young Black people. And so those early days were very much shaped by either being at protests, being in organizing meetings, or being in the library reading about prisons and segregation and police and schools and the sort of interaction of all of those things. Then it came time for me to, I finished coursework and I had to think about what I wanted my dissertation to be. And I was really becoming incredibly interested in public memory. So I started grad school in 2014, finished coursework in 2016-17. In 2017, several Confederate statues came down in my hometown in New Orleans, statues of P.G.T. Beauregard, Jefferson Davis, Robert E. Lee. And as I was watching those statues come down, I was thinking about what it meant that I grew up in a majority Black city in which there were more homages to enslavers than there were to enslaved people. And what are the implications of that? What does it mean that to get to school, I had to go down Robert E. Lee Boulevard? To get to the grocery store, I had to go down Jefferson Davis Parkway? That my middle school was named after a leader of the Confederacy? That my parents still live on a street named after after somebody who owned over 150 enslaved people? And because the thing is, that symbols and names and iconography aren't just symbols, they're reflective of the stories that people tell. And those stories shape the narratives that communities carry. And those narratives shape public policy, and public policy shapes the material conditions of people's lives. And that doesn't mean that you just take down a 60-foot tall statue of Robert E. Lee, you suddenly get rid of the racial wealth gap. But it does, I think, help us recognize this sort of ecosystem of ideas and stories and narratives that help ground our understanding of the ways that certain communities have been disproportionately and intentionally harmed throughout American history. And so I was watching what was happening in my hometown in 2017. I was like, I have to write a dissertation. I've been thinking a lot about education and incarceration. I'd been working at a prison in Massachusetts, and then when I moved to D.C., I was working in D.C. jail. And so I had these two things where I was like, I'm really interested in public memory. I'm also really interested in what prison education looks like. And I was like, I'll just do both. It was a terrible decision. I mean, it worked out in the end.
I was going to say, I don't know, man.
It worked out on the back end. But the process of I decided to continue with my prison and incarceration work for my dissertation, and then to write How the Word is Passed as its own thing. Project. And writing a book and a dissertation at the same time. When I had my son was born in 2017, my daughter was born in 2019. So I was like writing 2 books, and I had 2 young kids, and then COVID hit. So it was a wild time. But I'm glad that I did it this way, because there's another version of this where I tried to write How the Word is Passed as my dissertation. And I think the nature of academia and what is expected of a dissertation in terms of the format, the way it's written, I think it would have been a very different project than what it ended up being. And what I'm really happy about is that I feel like, because I wrote my dissertation my dissertation ended up being about how young people who are sentenced to life without parole experience education while they're incarcerated. So like, what does education mean to a child who's been told they're going to spend the rest of their lives in a cage? And like, when education is stripped of its social utility, because we're always told you get education so one day you have enough money to buy a car and a house and provide for your family. When all of that is taken away, what does learning mean? What does education mean? So that was my dissertation work, and I was so grateful to have the opportunity to do it. But it also like opened up this other space to write more freely from How the Word is Passed, and to allow it to be almost a kind of multi-genre project. I felt like I could bring my scholarly self, my poetry self, my journalist, all the different parts of me to this project in a way that made it, I hope, more dynamic than it otherwise would have been.
When I told my mom that I was talking to you today, she said, "Can't believe you get to talk to the author of one of my 5 favorite books of all time."
All time.
And I said, you've read a lot, Mom. That is wow. Impressive. But I also really love that book. So I'm glad that whatever had to happen to get How the Word is Passed to be How the Word is Passed, I'm very grateful for that. I have one last question for you. You're now a very successful nonfiction author. You still write beautiful books of poetry. Is there a moment, and I'll tell you mine, is there a moment when you felt like, I am in my career, I am where I'm supposed to be, I'm feeling like I've achieved what I've achieved? So there's this moment in the movie Back to the Future at the very end where a big box comes to the house, and they open it up and they say, "Oh, George, it's the finished copies of your new hit science fiction book." And it's not so much the readers or the awards or whatever, it's just the book itself is the reward.
And I remember my moment of that, my Back to the Future moment was when the first copies of Looking for Alaska, my first novel, came to my apartment in Chicago in 2005, and I opened it up, and there were the finished copies of the book. And that's the moment where that's the moment I think about when I'm running and I don't want to run anymore and I feel like I can't keep going. I think about that moment, I get a little boost of energy. Is there a moment like that in your life where you feel like you got a phone call or you just felt I'm where I'm supposed to be professionally?
That's such a good question. That's such a good story. I would probably say, people ask me all the time who the audience for How the Word Is Passed was. I think many authors get asked this question, but I think also Black authors get asked this question with a different level of curiosity, sometimes insidiousness, but there's something else that exists behind the question. Is like, are you writing this book for white people or to teach white people something, especially when you're writing about race, about history, or are you writing for your people, like for Black people or for, and oftentimes I think that's a false choice. As we, again, to come back to the both-andedness of things. But for me, the answer was always that I wrote How the Word Is Passed for like a 14, 15-year-old version of me. I wanted to write the sort of book that I felt like I needed in my high school American history class, the sort of book that would have given me the language, the toolkit, the context, the information to more effectively than I did as a kid, understand the history of my city, my state, my country, understand who me and my lineage were in relationship to my city, state, and country. Because I felt a huge gap. Part of what animated the decision to write How the Word Is Passed was that I felt a huge gap in my own understanding. I was like, I live in a city that was the heart of the domestic slave trade. My grandfather's grandfather was enslaved, and yet I do not understand the history of slavery in a way that is at all commensurate with the impact and legacy that it has left on this country. And so the book was like a journey of teaching myself many of the things that I wish I had learned when I was younger. And there was a moment when I got an email from a teacher at Ben Franklin High School, where I went to high school in New Orleans. And they said, all the history classes are reading How the Word Is Passed. Can you come talk to the students? And this was still in, this is like the tail end of COVID, or I wasn't able to travel, but I Zoomed with these students at Ben Franklin. And like saw the class. It was like the same classroom that I sat in, the same, maybe, hopefully not the same desk, but the same, sitting in the same space that I had once been a student. And to see all of these students at my old high school reading my book, the book that I wrote for that version of myself, was just an incredible full circle moment. And it was like, you did the thing, like you did the thing you set out to do. You wanted to write the book that you needed in high school, and now students at your old high school are reading that book.
And you didn't get to go back for your senior year, but you did get to go back.
I did get to go back. I did. Wouldn't have thought, back in August of 2005 that's how I'd come back, but I made it back there in the end.
Thanks for watching this episode of College Journeys. We're all a little bit lost, but we can learn from each other. Whether you're just thinking about starting college, in the middle of it, or thinking about going back, Study Hall has resources to help you, from our fast guides to help you understand different college majors, to actually signing up for college-level courses through GoStudyHall.com. We can help you on your path.